Okay, we're just getting started here. So we're continuing on with the same journal article that I went over last week, or it was 2 weeks ago because the live last week had some technical difficulties with it, so I had to postpone it till this week. So this discusses intergenerational trauma and in very challenging situations. So we went over looks like I'm muted. Hello. I wonder if the audio is working now. Okay. Oh, you can hear me. Thank you, Ravina. Awesome. Okay, looks like we're good to go then. Okay, so I'm just going to go back up to the beginning here. So this journal article is after the catastrophe, working with the intergenerational transmission of collective trauma. So there was a lot that we discussed in the last video, and that should be linked in the description. So I'm going to go over the abstract a little bit here. So the psychological and emotional impact of the collective traumas and psychic catastrophes of the Jewish Holocaust, Stalin's gulags, and China's Cultural Revolution upon the second and third generation of survivors. So what we discussed before was there was the therapist, and as well there was the patient, and the patient was one of these second or third generation of survivors, and they experienced dreams and they experienced trauma of things that they didn't experience themselves, and so it affected them in various ways, and especially it affected their relationship, their work, and especially when they went back into areas that would trigger, and situations that would trigger those issues. And what was really sad was that he was experiencing this suspicion and isolation. He was even suspicious of the therapist themselves. And so this became a whole healing journey, and they did therapy quite often. I think it was about 4 times a week. And they were able to find healing really both in the therapists themselves and in the patient, and they had to navigate that dynamic where not the patient, but the client would project certain dynamics onto the therapist, and so they had to navigate through that. And this comes up for me in my life. Like, I did some videos on this earlier. You can look back. I was feeling angry towards my coworkers, towards my male coworkers, so that was coming out for me. Had a lot of sadness this week come up. And there are other things that indicate trauma, like chronic pain that doesn't seem to get resolved. So that was an issue, anxiety, gone through depression. And these are things that aren't directly related to a particular incident in my life, but I can see how they are affected through my ancestry or through my genes. Yeah, so if you are watching and you want to share in the chat like what you're hoping to get from this, you can go ahead and share. What we're going to be looking is more in the parent-infant interactions, I believe, is the next part. So this all affects your identity and your ability to function, and it can really show up later in life too. So we just finished this section here. The intergenerational transmission of trauma as seen in a Chinese infant observation. The intergenerational transmission of trauma related to the historical events of the Cultural Revolution era and other historical and collective traumas is an important theme in infant observations in China. We have observed that cultural trauma could be communicated both consciously and unconsciously to the infant by the caregiver. So that's a really important point right there, is how this cultural trauma is communicated not necessarily in verbal ways. And these narratives, we could see that last time. They were talking about how this pervasive fear and anxiety was not directly communicated, but was transmitted through the lived experience. Often these are hidden wounds experienced by the individual and the collective that can only be integrated through elaboration at both symbolic and verbal levels of discourse. And again, this clinician is trained in a lot of Jung's work, and Jung relied very heavily on analysis of dreams, which is really interesting because it is a very metaphysical approach, or something that what we're familiar now in the metaphysical space. So key points here: unconscious communication, hidden wounds. So these are things that are not coming up to the conscious mind. So it's like, oh, I provided everything the child needed, but the caregiver can be unconscious of the wounds or the trauma that they are passing on to the child. And this is really interesting because if we look at it from a survival perspective, then this is somewhat necessary for survival, because if we look in animals, the parents communicate to the young ways in which they need to survive. And as humans, that's going to be important too. We're not going to be able to communicate everything through language effectively, so a lot of it has to be transmitted through behavior, through tone. So this is interesting, and we might see how they discuss this and break it down, and whether this is solely through behavior or there is another level to it. Because of course thoughts and beliefs affect behavior, so it's difficult to separate them out. During the years of the Cultural Revolution, 1962 to 1976, between 1.5 and 2 million people lost their lives. Lives were often ruined through endless denunciations, false confessions, struggle meetings, and persecution campaigns. So there's a lot that is threatening people's lives, people's identities, that is tearing apart the social structure. So it's characterized by loss. The Chinese cultural skin became torn and tattered as historical temples and shrines were destroyed. And that affects identity, because a lot of people's identity can be very much tied to their traditions, to their practices, to their beliefs. And traditional spiritual values, such as the ideas of Confucius and Lao Tzu, were considered outmoded. Many experienced a loss of social and economic status, and many lost their careers as intellectuals and teachers, and were sent to the countryside to work in the fields as universities and schools were closed. Oh, that is difficult, because knowledge and these people who transmitted knowledge, it is a means to which we can grow above the animalistic nature, above impulses, and we can differentiate between, oh, a tiger is chasing me, and oh, I'm anxious and stressed because of the social situation. Where we can shift ourselves out of past patterns and beliefs, so we can actually produce change in ourselves. Especially some of these teachings and beliefs were not normalized within society, were very difficult for the practical everyday lives of people, which is why they took a lot of study. But they were a mechanism towards self-actualization, and that was an avenue for them for that. And through that process, you can heal trauma, and you can challenge the societal structure. You can challenge your beliefs. You can challenge how you grew up. And if knowledge is lost, if intellectuals, teachers, universities, schools are lost, people lose that ability to activate their conscious mind in a really productive way. And that's really sad, because that's how I worked through my trauma, through my emotional wounds. A lot of it was through becoming educated, and that changes the way you think. Students turned against those teachers and professors who were suspected of being against Mao's ideology. This loss of security and trust created fear and mistrust that led to tears in the Chinese cultural skin that have been difficult to heal. Yeah, so it can only be healed through the process of open dialogue and cultural atonement. And in China, some believe this reparative process has failed to fully occur. This is interesting, because if you're familiar with the, what's it called? There's some studies that study the process of human development. So it's not just human development at an individual level, but also at a societal level. And it takes a very long time to build that up. And right here, you can see it's really taking a step backwards. If you have a society at a very low level of development, that's going to hinder their progress. At lower levels of development, you're going to see a lot of fighting. You're going to see violence. You're going to see intolerance. And then that reduces as you go up different levels of development. So this is going to be precipitating huge problems. The intergenerational transmission of trauma emerged in the observation of baby Tao. Baby Tao appeared during the first year of observations to have developed a disorganized attachment with his mother. The observer was concerned about the high level of disorganization in the infant, as the child's behavior included hitting himself, hitting his mother and grandmother, and not being able to manage separations from mother that were unpredictable and lacking in transitioning behavior. The mother told the observer that she was having difficulty managing her baby, and the grandmother was not able to provide adequate containment. The mother requested a referral for psychotherapy that she subsequently appreciated and benefited from. So they're observing this child or baby at 12 months, 2 weeks. So I'm going to summarize this. When I arrive for the observation, the baby is beginning to stand and walk on the feet with some difficulty. The mother is present, but does not do anything to prevent the fall that is imminent. The baby starts to cry, but the mother does not come over to him, but appears to ignore him. I feel pain and empathy with the baby, and after several minutes go over to him and lift him up. The mother then comes over to hold him, and the grandmother comes into the room. The mother takes me aside as the grandmother takes care of the baby, and she starts to tell me how difficult her life is with her husband, how she was traumatized as a child, which included being chained to a bed when her parents were not at home. I listened and experienced her torment when she told me this. I began to think that the difficulty that she had with the separations from her infant might be linked to the childhood trauma she is telling me about. Could be. She then talks about how her parents were mistreated, ostracized, and beaten during the Cultural Revolution. So when people are in an environment which is very dangerous, which threatens their life, they can develop this desensitization, or lack of empathy. And even more than that, they can act out some inhumane behaviors towards the infant. So they haven't said anything about this yet, but her parents were in a very challenging period. Focused on survival. So it's unclear whether unclear whether this trauma is because of neglect by the parents because they were so stressed by the environment, or there was that underlying abuse there that was being enacted in this vicious cycle. And it could be more than just being chained to the bed. Like, that could be a memory or a symptom that she can hold on to. But it could be a whole host of issues that can be difficult to talk about. Because when someone goes through trauma, a lot of the times they don't have the freedom to talk about it. So it's really, really difficult for them to even express what happened to them and acknowledge that that was damaging and that was hurtful. So we just get this one symptom and we don't know the full extent of it. She then talks about how her parents were mistreated, ostracized, and beaten during the Cultural Revolution as they were suspected of being capitalists. Some relatives were killed, and the whole family went through emotional upheavals, dislocations, and loss. So they ended up observing the mother just as much as they observed the baby. But this seems significant as the mother appeared to be able to hold the baby in mind more effectively after this conversation. So it sounds like the mother was still dissociated, that being in that trauma causes you to dissociate, and then you dissociate as long as you don't feel the freedom to feel those emotions, to feel through what happened. And it sounds like just talking about this allowed her to open up to that and process it and connect. She needed to have her own infantile child self seen and acknowledged, and her rivalry for my attention in the observation seemed to diminish. So that is a very key, important point there. Very, very difficult to be a parent if you haven't healed your childhood wounds, and the child can actually trigger those childhood wounds. So, and then talk about how this infant observation method helps understand the profound nature of early interactions and their impact on the developing psyche of the child. So they talk about a Lithuanian-born philosopher, Levinas, whose family was Jewish. And so they're saying how this philosopher was affected by the Holocaust. And a lot of their work emerges out of that tragic cultural complex. So they discuss it some more. Yes, facing traumas definitely helps with the healing process. That includes talking about it. Even writing helps a lot. Yeah, thanks, Ravina. Yeah, this is the struggle that we face, is that we are all affected deeply by our families and how we grew up and a society that we lived in. And we're all in this soup together. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time journaling. And it's really challenging because it can take a long time to put together the pieces. And that's really what's been happening for me lately, is I've been putting together the pieces and being able to put together the cohesive story. Yeah, so with this infant observation in China, the mother experienced that secure base, where she could elaborate and reflect upon her trauma. So they expand a little bit on like how they're doing this work and like the complex nature of it, that they're using their imaginative and intuitive capacities to perceive what is happening both on the surface level of interaction and beneath the surface. So there's some guesswork involved. And that's when we're constructing our narratives, when we are reconstructing our narratives to make sense of our lives, right? If you have a narrative that's like, oh, I'm experiencing symptoms of trauma, but I don't have any trauma, and that narrative doesn't make sense, and it's very disorienting. But when you construct a new narrative where you understand, oh, I can see how this trauma was passed down to me, and how I grew up in an environment where that was unconsciously communicated to me, that the subconscious level, the layer of beliefs of your parents affected the beliefs that you had growing up and how you approached the world. And that could be the world is a scary place and it's not safe to take risks. So that can affect you starting a business. That can affect you trying to go into a career that's very challenging but very rewarding. It can affect you trying to go for a promotion at work. It can affect you choosing a partner. It can affect you dating, because it can show up as beliefs of not being good enough. And these beliefs reflect that paradigm growing up where you have to put yourself down in order to appease. You have to transform yourself into something that is non-threatening to the powers that be. And so a lot of the insecurity that can come up with us in modern day can be rooted in these very deep things. Yeah, so you've got the different levels of communication, which allows us to reflect on what is common to us all. And there's these richly woven tapestries of divergent cultural heritages, which matter. Okay, so it looks like we've got references, so that might be the end of that. Translation. Okay, so I think that is the end of that. So I thought it was going to be a bit longer. So that's it for this article. So definitely some interesting aspects here. So I'm glad that it didn't take too long to finish this one, so we can move on to another one. Lots of different topics to expand and explore here. So what I'm going to do is probably condense and summarize the different topics that were brought up here and things that we can explore later. I feel like some energies have to be healed, so they surface through different scenarios. Absolutely. The scenario story only helps the energy to surface, but we get tangled up in the story and never heal. it can delay healing. Yeah. Some people get so tangled up that they don't heal. But I suspect that because you're here, you're very interested in unearthing that story and doing the healing process. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining and commenting. So I don't have anything else prepared for today. I'll probably do the summary next week. Might be at a similar time on Saturday. And yeah, we can continue the discussion. So thank you so much for joining, and thank you for your feedback and input. Definitely ready to heal. Thank you very much for helping us in this process. Thank you so much. Wow. Oh, this has been incredible. Like, just this process of starting this YouTube channel and making these videos, because it, like, they're triggering me. Like, I make the video and then it triggers me, and it's really forcing me to face all of those fears coming up. Like, I'm seeing like self-hatred coming up, like, you can't do this, and like the themes that I've mentioned, like feeling, oh, you're not going to be successful and it's not worth it, and like this intense resistance, and and lots of sadness too. And it's so wonderful to see the comments and get that feedback and really do this journey along with you, because this is a beautiful journey, because it allows us to discover the magic power that we have to transform ourselves and our lives. Did I not show the journal article? Oh, I did. It's showing, right? Okay. My setup's a little too complicated. Anyways, so hopefully we'll talk to you soon, or see you soon, if you decide to join again. And again, thank you for watching.